My name is Margaret Coleman. And if there's one thing people should know about me, it's that I gave everything I had for my children. I was only 39 when my husband passed, leaving me with 2 kids to raise and a mountain of bills I didn't know how to climb. For years, my life was a cycle of long days and even longer nights. I worked double shifts at the nursing home, then cleaned office buildings after hours. My hands were cracked from bleach, my knees sore from scrubbing, but I told myself it was worth it. Every dollar I saved was a dollar closer to keeping food on the table and a roof over our heads. Anthony, my son, was my pride. From the time he was a boy, I saw something in him. He was ambitious, always talking about big dreams. He used to tell me, "Mama, I'll take care of you one day. You won't have to work like this forever." Those words kept me going through the cold nights when I came home too tired to even eat. I told myself that if I could just get him started in life, everything I sacrificed would make sense. By the time Anthony turned 26, he came to me with a plan. He wanted to start a small delivery company. Nothing fancy, just a couple of vans, a storage unit, and contracts with local businesses. He had the drive, but not the money. He asked me if I could help him. I didn't even think twice. I dipped into my savings account, pulled out the nest egg I had been building for years, and I even went down to the bank and signed for a small loan in my own name. I remember sitting at that desk, my signature trembling on the paper, knowing I was putting my future on the line, but it was for my son. That made it worth it. When I handed Anthony the money, his eyes lit up like I had given him the world. He hugged me tight and promised, "Mama, I'll never forget this. One day, I'll pay you back 10 times over." Those words felt like gold to me. Finally, all the years of going without new clothes, all the birthdays I skipped for myself, all the aching shifts, it felt like it was paying off. I told myself this would be the moment that bound us closer, that he would finally see me not just as his mother, but as the woman who laid the foundation for his future. At first, things seemed to move in the right direction. Anthony was out early, coming home late, talking about contracts, deliveries, and clients. He even brought Kendra, the woman he was dating, to meet me. I welcomed her with open arms, thinking she would be part of this new chapter for us. I cooked for them, prayed over them, and reminded Anthony that marriage was about building together. I believed with all my heart that everything I had poured into him would come back to me in love, respect, and stability. I remember one Sunday afternoon, not long after he got the business off the ground. I visited him at the office he had rented. It wasn't much, just a 2-room space with folding chairs and a desk, but when I stepped inside, I felt proud. My son had something with his name on it. My sacrifice had turned into something tangible. I smiled as I looked around, telling myself that one day when people asked Anthony how he got started, he would say, "My mama believed in me when nobody else did." That was the story I wanted told. That was the truth I wanted remembered. But sacrifice is a strange thing. You give it with open hands, never imagining it could be twisted or forgotten. You convince yourself that love will protect the truth. I didn't know then how quickly people can rewrite history. I didn't know how easy it was for others to step into your story and erase you from the very thing you built. All I knew in that moment was that I had done what any mother would do. I gave my all, believing it would bind my family closer. I couldn't see the cracks forming yet. I couldn't hear the whispers starting to shift. And I certainly didn't know that the very sacrifice I believed would keep me close to my children would one day be used to push me out of their lives entirely. But I would learn. And when I did, I would make sure they learned too. When Anthony's business began to take shape, I thought I could finally breathe. The vans were moving, contracts were coming in, and for the first time, I saw him stand tall as a man. People in the community started talking about his hustle. They admired how quickly his little delivery company was expanding. I was proud, not for myself, but for him. Every wrinkle in my hands, every aching night I had worked, felt worth it. But success has a way of changing the story. It doesn't take long before people forget the struggle and only see the shine. And sometimes the people closest to you are the first to erase the truth. It started small. At barbecues and birthday parties, I'd hear Kendra casually brag. When Anthony wanted to start his business, it was my family that believed in him. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe she meant her support, her encouragement as his girlfriend. But soon, her words sharpened. She claimed her parents had helped financially, that her side of the family had given Anthony the backing he needed. I remember standing there, holding a paper plate of food, listening as relatives nodded along like it was fact. My chest tightened. I wanted to speak up, to say, "That's not true. I took out the loan. I emptied my savings." But when I glanced at Anthony, expecting him to correct her, he said nothing. He smiled, let her talk, and kept eating. That silence was louder than any words. At first, I convinced myself maybe he was just avoiding an argument. Maybe he thought it wasn't the right time. But the more gatherings we attended, the bolder Kendra became. She told the story so many times with such confidence that it became the version people believed. Soon, when others asked Anthony how he did it, he'd just shrug, let Kendra answer. Or worse, he'd nod along like it was true. The woman I had welcomed into my home, the one I cooked for and prayed over, was rewriting history right in front of me. And my son, the very one who had hugged me with tears in his eyes when I gave him my last savings, stood by and let it happen. It wasn't just my pride being stolen. It was my legacy. For mothers like me, respect is everything. We don't work ourselves to the bone just to be erased from our children's stories. We sacrifice because we want them to remember who stood in the gap, who held them when no one else would. And here I was being scrubbed out of my own son's success story by a woman who never lifted a finger for him in those early days. I tried once to correct it. At a family dinner, Kendra repeated her tale about how her family gave Anthony his start. I cleared my throat and said gently, "Well, I remember it different. I know what I signed at that bank." My voice was steady, but my hands trembled under the table. The room went quiet for a moment, and I thought Anthony would finally step in. Instead, he chuckled, changed the subject, and left me sitting there, looking like the bitter old woman trying to grab credit. That was the moment I realized silence can be its own betrayal. He didn't have to insult me to wound me. He only had to let someone else erase me while he looked the other way. From that day forward, I noticed the shift. People no longer came to me with congratulations or pride about Anthony's business. They saved it for Kendra. At church, folks would pat her on the back, calling her the reason Anthony had made it. My name wasn't mentioned. My sacrifices weren't remembered. And every time I saw the satisfaction flicker in Kendra's eyes. She wasn't just proud of the lie, she was proud of taking my place. The more she spoke, the more invisible I became. But I kept my composure. I smiled when I had to, nodded when I didn't want to, and carried my silence like a stone in my chest. Because deep down, I knew something important. Lies have a way of catching up with the people who spread them. And the day would come when silence would no longer protect Anthony, and Kendra's rewriting of the story would crumble under the weight of truth. I didn't know when. I didn't know how. But I knew it was coming. And when it did, the world would finally remember who I was. In the early years, whenever Anthony's name was mentioned in a room, my name followed. People would say, "That boy had a strong mother behind him," or "Margaret, you raised a good one." Those words filled me with pride. They reminded me that the sleepless nights and endless work shifts hadn't been for nothing. My sacrifices were seen, my voice was heard. But as Kendra's version of events spread wider, something inside those gatherings began to change. Slowly, I became invisible. At first, it was subtle. A conversation would start about Anthony's growing company, and I'd lean in, ready to share a detail or a proud memory. But before I could speak, Kendra's voice would rise above mine. She always had a way of commanding attention, twisting the story to suit her, as if I wasn't even there. One Sunday dinner, Anthony's uncle complimented him on a new delivery contract. I smiled, about to mention how I remembered the day Anthony landed his first client, how nervous he had been, how I prayed with him that morning before he left. But as soon as I opened my mouth, Kendra cut across me, laughing loudly about how her father had given Anthony the right advice that sealed the deal. My words withered in my throat, drowned out like they had never existed. The uncle nodded, clapped Anthony on the back, and Kendra beamed. Nobody turned to me. Nobody asked for my memory. It didn't happen just once. It happened over and over in living rooms, at cookouts, even at church socials. The spotlight shifted away from me entirely. When I tried to contribute, people glanced past me as if my voice carried no weight. The woman who once had been respected as the backbone of her family now sat at the table like a shadow. The humiliation grew, not in loud insults, but in silence. That's what cut deepest. The silence after I spoke, the quick subject changes, the way eyes slid past mine to rest on Kendra. She had managed to not only steal my credit, but also my place. Where once I had been the matriarch, the anchor, I was now treated like an afterthought. There was one moment that stays etched in my mind. It was Thanksgiving. The house was full, laughter bouncing off the walls. Anthony carved the turkey, while Kendra held court at the table, telling the story of how her family had carried Anthony in the early days. My grandson, Jordan, sat wide-eyed, listening. I tried to speak up, softly correcting, "Well, I remember it a little different." Before I could finish, Anthony chuckled and said, "Mama, you always want to argue details." The table erupted in laughter, not with me, but at me. I sat there, forcing a smile, my fork heavy in my hand. Inside, my chest burned. That was the moment I realized my voice wasn't just being ignored. It was being ridiculed. My own son was teaching the family that my words didn't matter. It's a special kind of pain when your children silence you. It's not like the sharp sting of an insult. It's duller, heavier, like a slow erasure. You begin to wonder if your life's sacrifices are slipping into nothing, if your history will be rewritten until there's no trace of you left at all. I went home that night and sat in my quiet kitchen, staring at the walls I had worked so hard to keep standing. I thought about the years of struggle, the bills I had juggled, the meals I had skipped, the nights I had stayed awake so my children could sleep. And I realized something. All of it meant nothing to them now. They had taken the story and made it theirs. But erasure has a way of planting a seed, and humiliation has a way of turning silence into fuel. I didn't speak out that night. I didn't demand the table listen. I held my tongue, even as the laughter echoed in my ears long after everyone else had gone home. But deep inside, I felt something shift. They thought my voice had been dimmed. What they didn't know was that I was waiting for the moment to remind them who I was, waiting for the silence to end with the kind of truth no one could laugh over. For years, my daughter Denise kept her distance from me. She was the kind of child who held on to grudges the way some hold on to heirlooms. She carried them carefully, never letting them go, always reminding you they were still there. When she left home, she swore she would make it on her own, without my help, without my interference. We spoke here and there, but the bond was fractured. I had always known she resented me for helping Anthony more than her. She would say it outright sometimes, sharp words laced with hurt. You always saw more in him than you did in me. You gave him everything, and you left me with nothing. No matter how I tried to explain, she didn't hear that my sacrifices for Anthony had been sacrifices for her too. A stronger brother meant a stronger family. That's how I saw it. But Denise only saw favoritism. So when she suddenly began showing up again, years after silence, I knew something was behind it. At first, she was polite, even warm. She came to family dinners, joined conversations, and slipped back into the circle like she had never left. But it didn't take long for me to see the shift. She wasn't returning for me. She was aligning herself with Anthony and Kendra. Kendra was smart enough to see Denise's bitterness as a weapon. She fed it carefully, stroke by stroke, reminding Denise of every slight, every sacrifice she thought had been stolen. Your mama gave Anthony the business, not you. I overheard Kendra say once, her voice low but cutting, he's always been her favorite. She never gave you a chance. The words sank deep, and Denise let them. Instead of defending me, instead of questioning why another woman would fuel such fire, she leaned into it. Soon, she was laughing at Kendra's side during conversations, joining in when my voice was brushed aside. If Kendra told the story about how her family backed Anthony, Denise nodded along, eyes darting to me as if daring me to contradict. If I tried to bring up the truth, Denise rolled her eyes, muttering, "There she goes again." It was a fresh wound layered on old scars. I had already lost my place in Anthony's story. Now, the daughter I had carried for 9 long months, the daughter I had struggled to clothe and feed after her father's death, was helping push me further into silence. One evening, at a cookout, Denise went further than she ever had. Standing with a group of relatives, she said loud enough for me to hear, "Mama always babied Anthony. That's why he's successful. She never believed in me the same way, but Kendra did. Kendra always reminded me I had worth." Her words stung sharper than Anthony's silence ever had. It wasn't just betrayal. It was my own child choosing another woman to stand in the place that should have been mine. I stood there, hands clasped in front of me, keeping my face still. But inside, my spirit shook. How much betrayal could one mother endure? How many times could the children she raised turn their backs? and let outsiders drive the knife deeper. I didn't speak that night. I didn't argue or defend myself, because by then I had learned something valuable. Every betrayal carries its own weight. Denise thought she was punishing me by siding with Kendra, but all she was really doing was tying herself to a woman whose lies and schemes were bound to collapse. And when that day came, Denise would find herself caught in the same fall. By the time Denise had planted herself firmly at Kendra's side, I had stopped expecting support from my children. I kept to myself, speaking less, watching more. It was in that silence that I began to notice patterns, little cracks in their polished picture, signs that things weren't as smooth as they pretended. At dinners, I caught whispers behind closed doors. Muffled arguments between Anthony and Kendra would slip through the walls, voices tense and hurried. They would emerge minutes later, faces stretched into forced smiles, as if nothing had happened. I saw the way Anthony's jaw tightened when Kendra laughed too loudly with cousins, or how she rolled her eyes when he tried to lead a conversation. To everyone else, it looked like playful banter. To me, it looked like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Money seemed to be the core of it. I'd notice Anthony reaching for his wallet at family outings, only to pause, mutter something about waiting for a transfer, then slip away to make a phone call. At other times, Kendra flaunted expensive new clothes or jewelry, her nails perfectly done, her purse always a brand name. She carried herself like a woman with endless means. But Anthony's face betrayed him. He looked drained, his skin pale from long nights, his eyes shadowed. One Sunday, after church, I overheard two women whispering. They weren't speaking to me, but their voices carried. I heard Kendra's been at that casino again. One said, "Anthony must be losing his mind over it." My hands froze on the casserole dish I was holding. I didn't say a word, but my ears rang with the weight of what I had just heard. It wasn't long before the rumors became harder to ignore. A neighbor mentioned debt collectors had been seen at Anthony's office. A cousin hinted that he'd borrowed money he hadn't repaid. When I looked back, I realized the signs had been there all along. The evasive finances, the quiet arguments, the tension that hung in the air like humidity before a storm. At first, I wanted to believe it wasn't true. This was the son I had sacrificed everything for, the boy I had lifted out of nothing. But the more I saw, the clearer it became. Anthony wasn't building an empire. He was patching holes in a sinking ship, and Kendra, with her careless spending and reckless habits, was cutting holes faster than he could fill them. The bitter part was that none of it surprised me. Kendra had always lived for appearances. The clothes, the parties, the lies she told about who had backed Anthony's business. They were all part of the same need to look better than she was. And Anthony, my son who once promised to repay me tenfold, was too weak to stop her. Instead of standing firm, he was being dragged down, silently drowning while she smiled for pictures. I watched closely, but I kept my observations to myself. Because one thing I had learned was that storms reveal themselves. You don't need to chase the thunder. If you wait long enough, the lightning will strike. And when it does, everyone sees what was hidden. So I stayed quiet sitting at their table, folding my hands, keeping my face calm. They thought I was blind, that age had dulled my eyes. But I saw it all, the cracks in their marriage, the strain in their finances, the desperation in their voices when they thought no one was listening. It was only a matter of time before their secrets spilled out. And when that day came, no one would remember their lies. they would remember the truth. It was Jordan's 12th birthday, and for once, I felt excited. I had been putting money aside for months, skipping little comforts here and there, determined to give him something meaningful. A brand new laptop. Not just a machine, but a gift to help him with schoolwork, to give him opportunities one never had. I wrapped it carefully, tucking the receipt inside the box in case it ever needed repairs, and walked into Anthony's home with my head high. The house was full that day. Balloons tied to chairs, children running in and out, relatives gathered around the dining room. Everyone was laughing, eating, drinking. When I stepped inside, I could feel the eyes on me. Some warm, some cold. Kendra was at the center of it all, playing hostess like a queen in her castle. I carried the box into the living room where Jordan sat, beaming as I handed it to him. "Happy birthday, baby," I said softly. He tore into the wrapping paper, his face lighting up when he saw the sleek black laptop inside. For a moment, I saw pure joy in his eyes. That moment didn't last. Kendra swooped in like a storm. Her smile was thin, her movements sharp. "Oh no," she said loudly, her voice rising above the chatter. "We don't need this. We don't need her little pity gifts." Before I could react, she snatched the box from Jordan's lap. I froze, my hands trembling at my sides. The room quieted. All eyes were on her as she marched across the room to the fireplace. Without hesitation, she yanked the laptop from the box, flipped open the metal gate, and tossed it into the flames. The fire hissed, plastic crackling as smoke curled upward. Gasps filled the room. My heart clenched, but I stood still. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Anthony stepped forward then, not to stop her, but to laugh. A deep, cruel laugh that carried across the room. "You're not welcome here, fat pig," he sneered, his voice ringing in my ears like a slap. The words sliced deeper than any knife. My son, the boy I had carried, fed, clothed, and built a future for, was standing there, humiliating me in front of his wife, his child, and every relative watching. Jordan's face crumpled. He looked from me to his father, then back again, confusion clouding his young eyes. But no one stopped it. No one spoke up. Denise smirked in the corner, arms crossed, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Kendra stood proudly, her hands on her hips, watching the flames consume, not just the laptop, but the last shred of dignity she thought I had left. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I smiled. A small, tight smile that hid the storm raging inside me. They thought they had broken me. They thought that moment of public disgrace would end me. But what they didn't realize was that humiliation can be a seed. And in me, it had found soil. I looked at the ashes curling in the fire, listened to the laughter, and said nothing, because I understood something in that instant. Revenge doesn't always begin with rage. Sometimes it begins with silence. When the party was over, I left without a word. No goodbyes, no arguments, just quiet steps out the door, the weight of their insults pressing on my back. But inside, I had already shifted. Something hard had settled in me, something that would not let this go unanswered. They had burned my gift, mocked my sacrifice, erased me from the story of my own son's life. But they had also handed me something far more valuable than respect. They had handed me resolve. And soon they would learn that when you push a woman who has given everything, you don't just bruise her, you awaken her. After the fire, I moved in silence. The laughter, the insults, The humiliation they thought had broken me, it had done the opposite. I wasn't rushing, and I wasn't planning to fight them with words. What I needed was proof. Proof of the sacrifices I had made. Proof of the truth they had erased. Proof that would stand taller than Kendra's lies and Anthony's silence. I started at home. I pulled down the old shoebox from the top of my closet, the one I had almost forgotten about. Inside were the slips of paper I had kept through the years, the deposit stubs from when I emptied my savings, the receipts from payments I had made on the loan. My name was written across each one in black ink and bank stamps that didn't fade with time. As I shuffled through them, my hands steadied. This wasn't just paper, it was my life carved into numbers. Next, I dug into a locked drawer I hadn't opened in years. Folded neatly inside was a letter Anthony had written in his own handwriting back when he was desperate, thanking me for putting everything on the line and promising he'd make it right. I remembered the day he gave it to me, his eyes full of sincerity. Now, reading those words again, the betrayal stung sharper, but it also gave me strength. He might have let Kendra rewrite history, but his own hand had once written the truth. I carried the documents to the dining table, spreading them out like puzzle pieces. Bank statements, loan slips, repayment notes never fulfilled. My own calendar notations from those years, tracking every payment due. Each item told a story, one they thought had been buried under Kendra's lies. Piece by piece, I was rebuilding the truth. But I didn't stop there. I remembered conversations, names of people Anthony had borrowed from in the early days, people who knew it was me backing him when no one else would. I began calling them quietly. Old coworkers, family friends, even a cousin who once co-signed a small delivery contract. Some were hesitant, but a few still remembered clearly. Yes, one told me over the phone, "We all knew you put your money into that boy." Kendra wasn't anywhere in the picture back then. I wrote down every statement, every name. I wasn't moving like a mother anymore. I was moving like an investigator. And with each slip of paper, each memory unearthed, I felt my dignity return piece by piece. What struck me most wasn't just the evidence. It was how easily they had assumed I had nothing. They thought because I stayed quiet, I had no defense. They thought time had erased my sacrifices. But they didn't know I was a woman who kept records. They didn't know the very habits I built out of survival. Writing things down, keeping receipts, storing away documents would become the weapon I needed. I didn't share any of it yet. Not with Denise, not with relatives, not even with the people who still whispered about what Kendra had claimed. I kept it close, stacked neatly in folders I labeled myself. Let them laugh. Let them parade around with their false story. Because soon, when I pulled back the curtain, there would be no debate. And I knew one thing for certain, paper doesn't lie. Kendra could twist words. Anthony could stay silent. Denise could roll her eyes. But none of them could argue with stamped bank slips, signed letters, and documented loans. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel erased. I felt steady. I felt armed. The foundation of their lies had begun to weaken, and they didn't even know it. I closed the folders, slid them into a drawer, and locked it. Then I sat back, folded my hands, and let the thoughts settle in my mind. When the time came, the same papers they had ignored would be the very proof that destroyed them. The thing about lies is that they don't age well. They may shine at first, polished and convincing, but with time, the surface begins to chip. And when the first crack appears, The whole mask eventually falls away. It started with whispers. A cousin pulled me aside after church, lowering her voice, as if she were sharing forbidden news. I heard Kendra's been at the casino again. She said, "Not once, not twice, but regular. She's gambling Margaret. Heavy." I nodded, keeping my face calm, but inside my mind sharpened. I had suspected as much from the way Kendra flaunted new things. Purses, clothes, shoes that didn't match the reality of their finances. But hearing it confirmed from someone outside their house told me what I needed to know. People were starting to notice. Not long after, another piece of the puzzle surfaced. A neighbor mentioned debt collectors showing up at Anthony's office. They asked for him twice this week. She whispered, "Looked serious." I didn't ask questions, didn't feed the gossip, but every word etched itself into my memory. The whispers began to spread. Friends they once impressed started exchanging side glances when Anthony and Kendra walked into gatherings. Invitations grew fewer. People who once admired their story were now questioning it. Their empire of appearances was weakening, and they didn't even realize how quickly. I watched closely, but I said nothing. I could have pulled out my folders then, my loan slips, Anthony's old letter, the receipts of every sacrifice I had made. I could have ended the charade in one night, but I knew better. Revenge is not rushed. A storm doesn't come with the first gust of wind. It builds, it gathers, it waits for the right moment to break. Anthony himself started to unravel. He looked restless at family dinners, his phone glued to his hand, his eyes darting whenever it buzzed. Kendra, on the other hand, laughed louder than ever, as if her volume could drown out the reality closing in on them. But I could see the tension between them in the smallest ways. The way Anthony's jaw clenched when she bragged about shopping trips, the way she rolled her eyes when he tried to steer conversations away from money. At one dinner, the cracks were visible for everyone to see. A relative mentioned hearing about Anthony's company cutting back, and instead of brushing it off, Anthony snapped. His voice rose, sharp and defensive. "People talk too much. Don't believe everything you hear." The room went quiet. Kendra smoothed it over with a fake laugh, but the damage was done. For the first time, his mask had slipped in public. I sat quietly through it all, my face still, my hands folded in my lap. To them, I looked like a woman past her prime, someone too weary to matter. They had no idea that I was taking it all in, storing every detail like another piece of evidence. They didn't know that their own cracks were exposing them more than I ever could. It was almost poetic. The lies they had told about me, the image they had built on my silence, were now eating away at them from the inside. I didn't need to raise my voice or argue my case. All I needed to do was wait, because lies spread fast, but the truth, when it comes, lands heavier. So I waited. I watched the cracks widen, the whispers grow louder, the debts creep closer, and I promised myself this. When the mask finally shattered, it would be me holding up the mirror for everyone to see. For all the years Denise kept her distance from me, I had hoped that one day we might find our way back to each other. A mother never stops hoping for her child, no matter how wide the gap grows. But when she returned to the family circle, it wasn't to rebuild with me. It was to align herself with Anthony and Kendra, feeding the bitterness she had carried since childhood. At first, she seemed happy to be back. She laughed louder than she used to, clung to Kendra's side, and played her role as though she had been there all along. But behind the laughter, I saw something I recognized too well: desperation. Denise wanted to belong, and Kendra knew exactly how to exploit that need. It started with whispers. Kendra would lean close to her at gatherings, reminding her of every perceived slight from the past. "Your mama always chose Anthony," she'd say softly. "She gave him everything. Left you with scraps. That's the truth, isn't it?" Denise nodded, her face tightening. She wanted to believe it, because believing it meant her pain had been justified all these years. So Denise became Kendra's defender. When I tried to speak, Denise was the first to roll her eyes. When relatives questioned the stories Kendra told, Denise backed her up, saying, "That's how it happened. I was there." She wasn't there, of course. She had been gone, building her own life, far from my sacrifices. But she said it anyway, and the wedge between us drove deeper. I could feel her slipping away completely, and yet I stayed silent, because I knew that people who align themselves with liars always pay a price. It didn't take long. One evening, at a cousin's cookout, I stood off to the side as Denise and Kendra chatted with a group of relatives. At first, it was laughter, Kendra bragging about her shopping trips, her casino luck. But then the conversation shifted. Denise said something about how much she appreciated Kendra supporting her, how Kendra had always valued her worth when I hadn't. Kendra smiled, that thin, sharp smile of hers, then turned her head slightly and said, "Well, of course I value you. Someone had to. You were always in Anthony's shadow. You needed someone to lift you up." The words were smooth, but the sting was clear. Denise froze, her laughter faltering. She tried to laugh it off, but her eyes darted around, catching the smirks of those listening. She realized then, in that moment, that the very woman she had chosen over me was mocking her just as easily as she mocked me. I saw the hurt on my daughter's face. I saw the flicker of recognition that she had been used. Kendra hadn't built her up. She had only weaponized her pain to deepen the cut between mother and daughter. Later that night, Denise pulled away from the group, standing alone by the food table. Our eyes met briefly across the yard. For the first time in a long while, I saw something raw in her expression: shame. Not the kind that leads to apology, but the kind that settles heavy, knowing you've helped destroy something you can't rebuild. But she didn't come to me. She didn't speak. Whatever bond we might have repaired had already been sealed in betrayal. She had chosen her side too many times, rolled her eyes too often, laughed at me too freely. The damage was done, and she knew it. I didn't approach her either, because some wounds aren't meant to be patched. Some wounds must remain open so the pain never leaves. Denise's shame was her own to carry, just as my silence was mine. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that their betrayals were only tightening the rope around their own necks. Every lie Kendra spread, every silence Anthony allowed, every eye roll Denise gave me, all of it was fuel. And when the moment came, the fire would burn through every last one of them. I had gathered my papers, stacked the receipts, tucked Anthony's handwritten letter into its folder. I had all the proof I needed, but proof means nothing if it stays locked away. To take down a lie, you don't just shout the truth. You let it seep out slowly, carefully, until the lie collapses under its own weight. That's exactly what I began to do. It started with an old friend at church. She sat beside me one Sunday, whispering about how proud Anthony must be of his success. I didn't argue. I didn't brag. I only pulled out one slip of paper, a copy of the loan agreement with my name signed at the bottom. "Sometimes success comes with a price," I said softly, sliding it across her hand. Her eyes widened as she read. She didn't say much, but I knew she wouldn't keep it to herself. In communities like ours, whispers travel faster than sermons. The next time came at a family dinner. Kendra was glowing, as usual, telling stories of how her family had been the backbone of Anthony's company. I stayed quiet until an uncle asked me directly, "Margaret, didn't you help Anthony back then?" I smiled and answered, "Help is one way to put it. Signed my name on the line, emptied my savings. Without me, there wouldn't have been a business to talk about." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue with Kendra. I just set the record straight in front of ears that had once only heard her story. From there, it spread. At another gathering, I let slip that Kendra had been lucky at the casino one too many times. I didn't accuse, didn't judge. I simply said, "I just hope her luck doesn't run out with the bills piling at Anthony's office." People laughed nervously, but the seed was planted. A week later, I heard from a cousin that folks were whispering about Kendra's gambling, questioning how far it had gone. Debt collectors made their work easier for me. More than once, someone mentioned seeing them near Anthony's office, asking questions. I didn't deny it. I didn't defend him. I only sighed and said, "Well, you can only cover up so much before the cracks show." That was all it took. The whispers carried themselves from one living room to another. I never forced the truth. I didn't hold meetings or shout accusations. I released it piece by piece, the way water seeps into a foundation until the whole structure weakens. And weaken it did. Relatives who once praised Kendra's version of the story now looked at her differently. Friends who had admired Anthony's rise began to question if it had been built on shaky ground. Even Denise, who had mocked me at Kendra's side, started keeping her distance when the talk shifted toward debts and gambling. She had hitched herself to Kendra's wagon, and now the wheels were coming loose. The best part was that I never had to lie. Every word I spoke was true. Every receipt, every slip, every reminder, all fact. I didn't need exaggeration. Their own actions were enough to unravel them. By the time spring turned into summer, the whispers had become common knowledge. You could feel it in the air. Anthony and Kendra still put on their polished smiles, still dressed in their finest at gatherings, but the room didn't receive them the same way. Conversations paused when they walked in. Laughter stopped a second too early. The same people who once praised them now watched them closely, waiting for the next slip, the next crack in the mask. I sat quietly in the corner of those rooms, hands folded, eyes calm. To anyone looking, I seemed like the old woman they had pushed aside. But I knew better. Every nod, every whispered agreement, every turned glance told me the truth. The image they had built was collapsing. And the beauty of it was this: they didn't even know it was me. Whispers have a way of growing teeth. What started as quiet talk behind closed doors soon became visible in how people acted. I didn't need to hear every word to know the tide was shifting against Anthony and Kendra. I could see it in the way folks looked at them. At first, it was subtle. A cousin who used to hang on Kendra's every word now excused herself when she started talking. A friend who always asked Anthony for business advice stopped calling altogether. At church, where Anthony once shook hands with half the congregation, people now offered tight smiles before walking past him. But then the cracks widened. Business partners began to step back. Contracts Anthony bragged about suddenly fell through. A man he'd worked with for years quietly withdrew from a joint project, citing uncertainty. What he meant was clear. Anthony's debts and Kendra's gambling had poisoned their reputation. Nobody wanted to tie their name to a sinking ship. Even the neighbors had shifted. Where once Kendra's flashy cars and designer purses had drawn admiration, now they drew suspicion. People whispered about how she could afford them, how often she was gone, and what kind of woman throws away a laptop in front of guests. Respect had been replaced with ridicule. Their house, once the center of gatherings, became a place people avoided. And then there was Denise. She had stood by them, backed Kendra's lies, even mocked me to make herself feel taller. But shame is a heavy thing, and Denise couldn't carry it anymore. After Kendra's cutting remark about her always being in Anthony's shadow, Denise began pulling away. She still came around now and then, but she no longer laughed as loudly at Kendra's side. Her eyes no longer sparkled with pride when she looked at her brother. Instead, she kept her distance, the wedge she had driven between us now trapping her too. Anthony and Kendra were left with each other, and that was no comfort. Their arguments spilled over more often. At a family dinner, Anthony snapped when Kendra bragged about a shopping spree, shouting that she was bleeding him dry. Kendra clapped back, throwing her glass down and storming out. The room went silent, everyone pretending not to notice, but the damage was undeniable. Their empire of laughter and lies had collapsed into bitter quarrels in full view of the people they once sought to impress. I sat through these moments, quietly, my face calm, my body still. I didn't gloat, didn't intervene. I didn't need to. The world was already watching them unravel. Their allies had turned into onlookers. Their supporters had become whisperers. And every eye in the room now saw what I had known all along, that the proud couple who once mocked me were nothing more than a hollow show. Isolation is a cruel punishment. It doesn't strike all at once. It eats slowly day by day until you're standing in a crowded room and realize no one is truly standing with you. That's where Anthony and Kendra were now. But this wasn't the end. No, not yet. Because while isolation stripped away their pride, I still held the final blow in my hands. The papers, the records, the undeniable truth, they were waiting. And when I chose to release them, there would be no mask left to hide behind. Their fall was nearly complete. All that remained was for me to show the world exactly who had built their false success and who they had tried to erase. The reunion had been planned months in advance. Relatives from near and far gathered in the rented hall, tables filled with food, children running between chairs, old stories and laughter echoing through the room. To anyone else, it was just another family celebration. But for me, it was the stage, the day I had been waiting for. I arrived quietly, sitting at the far end of the room, watching as Anthony and Kendra made their entrance. They walked in like royalty dressed to impress, smiles wide, heads high. Kendra clung to Anthony's arm, her laughter loud, her voice carrying across the tables. She greeted people like she owned the place, while Anthony soaked in the attention, pretending he hadn't felt the weight of debts, the sting of rejection, the silence of former partners. I watched it all without a word, my folder tucked neatly in my purse. They still thought the mask was holding, still believed they could fool the crowd. But the time had come to strip it away. When the moment felt right, I stood. The room quieted, heads turning toward me. Some smiled politely. Others shifted uncomfortably, as if unsure of what I would say. I cleared my throat, my voice steady. For years, I've listened to stories about how Anthony built his business. I've heard how Kendra's family financed it, how sacrifices were made by everyone but me. Tonight, I think it's time the truth is told. I opened the folder and pulled out the first set of papers, bank slips with my name on them, proof of the loan I had taken out in my own name. Gasps rippled through the room. I laid them on the table in front of me. These, I said, are the records of the loan I signed. Not Kendra, not her family, me. Next, I pulled out Anthony's old handwritten letter, his promise to repay me, his words of gratitude for putting everything on the line. I held it up so all could see. My son wrote this when he needed me. He thanked me. He acknowledged me. He promised to repay me, a promise he has never kept. The room grew still. All eyes turned to Anthony, who sat frozen, his face pale. Then came the final stack, notes from people who had seen the truth, neighbors who remembered my sacrifices, whispers about Kendra's gambling, and the receipts of debts piling under Anthony's name. Piece by piece, I laid it all out, the papers spreading across the table like a trail of evidence too heavy to ignore. This, I said firmly, is the truth. I built the foundation they stand on. And while I sacrificed, they erased me. While I went without, they mocked me. While I carried the weight, they laughed in my face. Gasps filled the room again. Some relatives looked away, ashamed they had believed Kendra's story. Others stared openly, shaking their heads at Anthony and Kendra. Kendra's face twisted, her confidence gone. She stammered, trying to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. The whispers grew louder around her. Anthony's silence, the very weapon he had used against me for years, now betrayed him. His refusal to speak, to deny, to stand up, it only confirmed everything. In that hall, their empire crumbled. The masks they had worn cracked beyond repair. No amount of laughter, no loud bragging, no expensive clothes could cover the truth spread bare in front of family, friends, and community. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I gathered my papers, slid them back into the folder, and looked around the room one final time. My sacrifices were not for nothing. I said quietly, and the truth always comes to light. Then I sat down, calm and composed, while Anthony and Kendra sat in silence, the weight of humiliation pressing down on them in full view of everyone they had once fooled. But even then, as satisfying as the reveal was, I knew this wasn't the end. The documents were only the storm. One final act remained, the blow that would make sure my legacy could never again be stolen or erased. The room was still heavy with silence after the papers had been laid bare. Kendra sat stiff, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for anyone who might still defend her. Anthony kept his head low, his hands fidgeting under the table, the weight of exposure pulling his shoulders down. For years they had painted me as invisible, erased me from the story, but now every eye in that hall had seen the truth. I could have stopped there. The evidence alone had been enough to crack their image in half. But revenge is never complete with just humiliation. It's about restoration, about securing what was once stolen so it can never be taken again. That was why I had saved my last card for this moment. I rose to my feet, once more, my folder tucked firmly under my arm. The room grew quiet again, waiting. I cleared my throat, my voice steady, calm, deliberate. There's one more thing I want to make clear tonight. I began. When I sold my home, I did not do it because I was broken. I did not do it because I had nothing left. I sold it with purpose. I paused, letting the words settle before continuing. The proceeds from that sale were not for Anthony. They were not for Kendra. They will never see a dime of it. Instead, every cent has been placed into a secured trust for Jordan's future, his education, his stability, his life beyond the chaos they created. Gasps rippled through the hall. Some covered their mouths. Others shook their heads in stunned silence. I saw Kendra's jaw tighten, her nails digging into her palms. Anthony's face crumpled, the reality sinking in that he had been cut out completely. I built my life on sacrifice. I continued, my voice firm. And I will not let those sacrifices be erased. My grandson will carry forward the truth of who I am and what I gave. My legacy will not be stolen by lies or wasted on greed. It will live on through him. There was no applause, no cheer, just the kind of silence that comes when dignity speaks louder than rage. The weight of my words settled on every ear in that hall, pressing down on the very people who had once laughed in my face. Anthony leaned back in his chair, his lips parted, but no words coming. Kendra muttered under her breath, her eyes glassy with fury. Denise sat frozen, shame written across her face. None of them moved. None of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say. I gathered my things, folded the papers neatly, and tucked them back into my bag. Then I straightened my shoulders and walked toward the door. My steps were slow, measured, but every one of them was heavy with the dignity they had tried to strip from me. I did not look back. As I reached the exit, I heard the low murmur of relatives behind me, not gossip, not whispers, but words of respect. They weren't pitying me anymore. They were acknowledging me. My name was no longer erased. It was etched into the story once again, this time in a way that could never be undone. That night, I didn't leave as the forgotten mother. I didn't leave as the fat pig they had mocked. I left as a woman who had taken back her name, her place, and her legacy. And as for Anthony and Kendra, they were left sitting in that hall, surrounded by the ashes of their lies, isolated, humiliated, and cut off from everything they once believed they controlled. I had given them my silence. I had given them my patience. And in the end, I gave them the sharpest revenge of all, foresight. Because sometimes the loudest victory doesn't come from shouting. It comes from walking away, leaving your enemies to choke on the emptiness they created for themselves.